Well, hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. In this episode, I'm diving into a question that might seem simple on the surface, but goes surprisingly deep. How have comic books influenced our everyday lives? So, at first glance, you might think comics are just cultural entertainment, superheroes, villains, and impossible battles, and sure enough, it can be all that, just simple fluff entertainment. But it obviously is a deeply held emotion for some people. And if you look a little closer, you'll realize they've quietly shaped modern culture in ways most people never stop to consider. From blockbuster movies and everyday language to education, fashion, and our very sense of morality. All of the influence of comic books is everywhere at all times. It's very pervasive, and yet we don't always notice it, right? So let's talk about how these pages became one of the most powerful cultural forces of the last century. So, for decades, comic publishers have built modern mythologies. Characters like Superman, Batman, Spider Man, Wonder Woman, Captain America, and the X Men, they're all recognized globally by this point. And you don't need to be a comic reader to know who they are. Their faces are on everything from t shirts and lunchboxes to video games and movie posters. They've become the folk heroes of the 20th and 21st centuries. And you could say they're right up there with Elvis, or the Beatles or something like that in terms of just sheer recognizability. And this raises an interesting question. Why do millions of people flock to comic book movies, which they never read the comic books for? They might have never actually picked up a comic book. And it mostly comes down to accessibility. The accessibility of these movies is a big part of why they've become bigger than ever before. I mean, obviously, people heard of Superman and Spider Man even before the movies were out, but man, they sure had a big impact. And of course, the Batman movies as well. So watching a movie is easy. You just sit down for usually like 2 hours with these movies and you get a complete story. And it seems pretty rare for a superhero movie to be under 2 hours. Even the first Superman movie from 1978, that's basically like a 2.5 hour watch. So these are epics. So they kind of command attention, and they require you to basically lend yourself to them for an extended period of time. So, right off the bat, there is sort of a built in structure that encourages you to keep paying attention, because if you want to take in all that information, like the origin story, maybe, and the origin story of the bad guy as well, and get immersed in that world, well, you're going to have to make a whole experience out of it. And reading comics can be intimidating more than watching a movie. Characters have history stretching back decades. New readers get overwhelmed, wondering, where do I start? Which stories matter? Do I need to read hundreds of issues to understand this? But a movie, it's just right there in front of you. You don't need to do a lot of research. The movie itself is supposed to do the job for you for the most part. And movies streamline that chaos of, wondering, where do I start? What's the best storyline to get into? Should I read the comic from the beginning? Well, they simplify decades of alternate universes, reboots, and complex continuity, and you're supposed to get sort of a clean narrative. And of course, not all superhero movies are going to be equal, so some of them have bad reputations more than others. Like, I remember when Batman versus Superman came out, people were instantly trashing the movie. They really didn't even give it a chance. And I'm here to tell you that it's actually not as bad as a lot of the critics and even the fans were making the movie out to be. Now, am I saying it's an absolute masterpiece? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's not quite the trash heap that some people were saying it was. And if you look at 2012's The Avengers, it's another movie that it really helps explain the importance of just streamlining the experience of these characters. The Avengers 2012 movie it's masterfully designed for audiences with zero prior Marvel knowledge. And I'm saying this as somebody who's never actually watched the Avenger movies. I haven't even seen a single one. But you know that they did some research going into that, like, how do we make sure that people can understand and relate to this movie, even if they were not fans of the Marvel heroes, you know? And they no doubt did a pretty good job of it because the Avengers franchise is definitely on the successful side. You didn't need to know Tony Stark's full backstory, the deep history between Thor and Loki, or why Captain America was suddenly in the modern world. The movie quickly establishes the basics. You've got a billionaire in a suit, a Norse god, a super soldier, and a giant green monster, and they're teaming up to stop an alien invasion. And you've got to kind of respect that movie's ability to make itself pretty well understood because they got a lot of these different characters and they had to cater to a mass audience who might not really be that well informed about, all of the winding road stories of those particular characters. And it worked because great stories don't require encyclopedic knowledge, they require compelling characters and clear emotional stakes. Now, again, it's up to you to decide if these are great stories, but it is a sign of good storytelling, at least, if you can bring all these different elements together and make it a successful story for a mass audience. There's something to that, even if you're not a huge Avengers fan, there's something respectable about that ability. And that's a part of modern storytelling, the ability to streamline stories so mass audiences can understand, or at least mostly understand them. And you've got different mediums and different experiences. Now, even when a film closely adapts a comic book storyline, the experience is still going to be fundamentally different. Movies offer movement, music, and performance, so seeing Robert Downey Jr. embody Tony Stark or Christian Bale become Batman, it creates an emotional connection that's distinct from reading illustrated panels. And really, if you think about it too, like the ability to convey all of that information in those small little panels, that's like a huge art form in its own in its own right. You've got a lot of ground to cover and a limited amount of space to do it. So, congratulations to all these superhero companies for making that format work over the years. It is an impressive thing to be able to do. And I was a comic book fan when I was younger. I don't read them nowadays. For some dumb reason, I just stopped doing that. Maybe it's because I wasn't that well off financially. I I basically had to rely on my parents to get me access to comics when I was a kid. So I was lucky that they sometimes did that. And I guess as a young adult, I just didn't want to spend money on it anymore. I kind of grew out of it, I suppose you might say. But I have followed some comic book movies over the years. Um, the X Men were my favorite comics as a kid because I like the message about, well, how they grappled with prejudice against themselves. And there's an interesting dynamic because obviously the X Men are powerful characters. So if they wanted, they could obviously mess up the human race. They they could wreck humanity's day if they really wanted, but they hold back, and they hold back against a world that hates them. And I just think that's an interesting premise. And the fact is that when you watch a movie like the X-Men, like the original one, and you're disappointed by it, like I kind of was, it kind of makes it a bit more of a task to stay involved in comic book movies. So it's not my favorite genre, but I do respect the ability to you know have all these different characters adapted into these unique storylines. Sometimes they change things from the comic books to the movies, and sometimes you're going to piss people off in the process. But, they have to sometimes make these bold decisions, or maybe sometimes they make them not because they have to, but because they maybe fumble the ball a little bit. I don't know. But it's an interesting dynamic between the comic books themselves and the movie universes that are spawned by them. And neither medium is inherently better, I would say. They're just different. Just as people enjoy film adaptations of novels without reading the book, superhero fans can love the movies without ever reading a comic. And it's rather interesting how that works. And it's also interesting how comic books have kind of changed the way that we speak. Beyond entertainment, comic books have fundamentally altered our language. Think about the terms that we might use every single day. Like superhero is a term that people throw around. Origin stories, sometimes you hear arch enemy, secret identity, all these different concepts seem to have been largely introduced to the world by comic books, and they've completely transcended the page in many ways, like because I think of world leaders as supervillains sometimes, and sure enough, sometimes they are like that, including a certain orange one, that I could go into more detail about. I'll let you figure out who I'm talking about there. But we constantly use words to describe real world figures like that. Political figures become heroes or villains, business rivals are labeled archenemies, and a celebrity's upbringing is framed as their origin story sometimes, And comics provide a shorthand vocabulary that helps us communicate some complex human dynamics instantly. So, like I said, my favorite example is being able to call somebody a supervillain, and I don't use that term often enough myself, but I think it really does convey just that a person is kind of rotten. Maybe it shouldn't be used that often. Maybe we shouldn't simplify things all that often. But I think it's a reliable way to describe somebody who is rotten to the core. And they've also, these superheroes and supervillains, they've shaped how we view things like responsibility, justice, and education. At their core, the best comic narratives, they have always tackled heavy moral questions, like I said that about the X-Men earlier. And you've got themes of responsibility, corruption, prejudice, and sacrifice, all that kind of stuff. So take the most famous line from Spider-Man: with great power comes great responsibility. And that principle resonates pretty much universally. It's quoted by parents, teachers, some corny ass CEOs, and politicians sometimes, because the core message is timeless. Power without responsibility is dangerous, whether you're a superhero or an elected official. And because of this depth, comics have also transformed education. So teachers and librarians regularly use graphic novels or graphic novel style images to engage reluctant readers. So they'll look for books that are like flashy and that have, lots of images in them. And I think that goes side by side with the influence of comic books over the years, because these parents and these teachers know that kids are often drawn to things like comic books because, well, they got flashy images and they're a little bit easy to understand and all that kind of stuff. So by pairing dynamic images with text, comics make complex ideas in history, literature, and science more accessible, and they make intimidating books more approachable. So, what was once dismissed as disposable entertainment is now a recognized classroom tool. Think about that. Like real change over time. And you've got a lot of visual aesthetics that have shaped modern ideals as well. You can see the comic book aesthetic almost everywhere you look in modern culture. The bold colors, the dramatic compositions, dynamic visual storytelling techniques, although all those things developed by comic artists have influenced generations of graphic designers and marketers. It shapes clothing, video games, packaging, and digital media. Even if you've never read a comic, you are constantly consuming art styles influenced, or you might even say birthed by them. They ultimately were hugely influential aesthetically. Ultimately, though, the greatest contribution of comic books is how they define heroism. Superheroes are symbols of our highest ideals. Superhuman, powers are fascinating. But, it's not just about the powers, it's also about the intelligence and the ethics. Superman represents hope, Batman embodies perseverance, Spider Man reminds us of responsibility, and Wonder Woman, she symbolizes things like compassion. And these stories ask us, what should you do when you have the power to help? And the answer is always the same: help anyway, even though it might be inconvenient, because don't you want to be like a hero or something like that? I don't know. Maybe you want to be an ethical person. Do it when it's tough, do it at a personal cost, and do it when no one is watching and no one's going to give you an award. These superheroes, they just do the right thing. That's part of who they are, part of their story. And comic books have shaped modern life so thoroughly that their influence is easy to overlook. They changed how we watch stories, how we speak, how we learn, how we design, and how we view morality. So, whether you've spent decades collecting issues or you only know these characters from the big screen, you have been shaped by them most certainly. Their stories are woven directly into the fabric of everyday life, to put it in sort of a cheesy way. And perhaps they're the greatest superpower. Perhaps that's the greatest superpower that comic books ever developed: the ability to change our culture so completely that we barely notice that it's happened. So, thanks for listening to this episode. And until next time, keep turning the page. And that's a cheesy way to end it, but whatever. I'm ending it on that note. Have a good one.